All right, so today's class continues what we were talking about in the last class, which is the Atlantic slave trade. And we're looking at two major readings here. We're looking at the very influential work of Eric Wolf, Europe and the People Without History. And then later we'll be looking at Walter Rodney's work called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Both these are seminal pieces of work and hugely influential. Eric Wolf's work is in the field of what we call social anthropology. He's an anthropologist. He's been deeply influential in the field of anthropology. And Walter Rodney, I think you could put him in as a historian or even in the context of political economy. So let's start with Eric Wolf. He tells us that America provided the major demand and Africa the major supply for what? For the Atlantic slave trade. I think we already know this from the previous class. The 18th century proved the golden age of slaving, with over 6 million people being forcibly exported from Africa between 1701 and 1810. It might come as a surprise to some of you that एक ऐसा निज़ाम जिसके बारे में ये कहा जाता है कि ये तो इसने तो सबको आज़ाद कर दिया फ्यूडलिज्म से, इसने तो जमहूरियत मुतारफ़ करा दी दुनिया के अंदर, इसकी वजह से बतदरीज आहिस्ता आहिस्ता ह्यूमन राइट्स और इंडिविजुअल राइट्स और ये सब चीज़ें जो हैं वो दुनिया के अंदर फैल गई. It will come as a surprise, I think, to some of you at least, to realize that in fact the origins of this system are in the Atlantic slave trade. And that's not just a minor affair. It involves millions of people and huge amounts of wealth that were created because of that slave trade. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade, yet almost 2 million more slaves were transported from Africa between 1810 and 1870, many of them destined for Cuba, the major Caribbean sugar producer in the 19th century. So even when the slave trade was legally, supposedly abolished, it still continued because it was so lucrative. What were these slaves doing in the Americas? They were producing cotton, they were producing sugar, they were producing tobacco. These were the major commodities. This is how they were transported from Africa to America across the Atlantic. This here is the bottom, the basement of a ship, and you can see how they are packed in like sardines, completely packed in. There's no space for them to move. There's no space for them to go anywhere. And you can imagine that the result of this kind of movement resulted in the loss of a huge number of lives. They are all lying down, correct. They are all lying down like that. And this, of course, is the top level of the same ship, the bottom level and the top level. So packed like human cargo, like sardines, in the worst imaginable possible way. At first, the main interests of the European traders, the Portuguese and others, was gold. They knew, and no doubt it wasn't incorrect, that in West Africa there were enormous reserves of gold to be mined. It was the search for gold and spices that prompted the early Portuguese voyages and the traders. They were shipping home gold, pepper, ivory, dyewoods, gum, beeswax, leather and timber, as well as, of course, slaves. And very soon, although initially they were principally interested in gold and these other things, spices, etc., soon the whole focus shifted to slaves. Why did it shift to slaves? That has to do with the Industrial Revolution itself. As the Industrial Revolution started to take off in the late 18th century, in around the 1780s, etc., then to feed the Industrial Revolution, the cotton that was needed to feed the Industrial Revolution had to come from agriculture. And that agriculture, of course, was done on these massive plantations in the north of America that are today known as slave plantations. So you needed a huge amount of labor to manage that production. Cotton agriculture, especially at that time, is an incredibly labor-intensive process. Everything has to be done by hand. So you can't do it by machines. You have to pick the cotton by hand. So you have to sow it and pick it, etc., and tend to it by hand. Incredibly labor-intensive, operation. So you needed massive numbers of people working these plantations to pick the cotton, to sow the cotton and to pick the cotton, to harvest it, etc. And all of that labor came mainly from Africa. Portuguese brought to Africa textiles from England, Ireland, France, and Flanders, wheat from Morocco, the offshore Atlantic islands, and Northern Europe, brass utensils, and glass beads from Germany, Flanders, and Italy, and oyster shells from the Canaries. So in return for the slaves and for other things as well, the Europeans were also selling certain commodities to them. They were selling textiles, clothes, and all of these commodities, as you've seen. So this was the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves would be shipped off from Africa. They would go to the plantation colonies in Brazil, in the south of America, and so on. They would plant the cotton, the tobacco, and the sugar and other things. They would send them to Europe. Europe would manufacture the final goods from those raw materials, and then those final goods would be shipped off all over the world, to China, they would be shipped off to India, they would be shipped off, of course, to Africa. Everywhere in the world, European traders would go and sell these commodities. But the heart of the production process, at the heart of the agrarian aspect of the production process, was slave labor. That is the origins of capitalism. Let that sink into your mind to understand how capitalism came about. Sao Tome became one of the spark plugs of the burgeoning trade in sugar and slaves. Between 1500 and 1530, its production of sugar increased 30-fold. By 1520, however, sugar planting had begun in Brazil, which soon became the greatest consumer of slaves. So you could see that on various islands, the Canary Islands, and these islands, etc., first the plantation mechanism was perfected, and then, boom, it was sent to Brazil, where it exploded into huge numbers. By 1660, however, the Dutch faced the first organized English competition in the shape of the so-called Royal Adventurers into Africa. So now the various European powers got into the act of going to Africa and basically getting slaves and selling commodities. And they began to compete with each other in this entire process. England led the way in this regard. It had by now, it didn't lead the way in the sense of historically speaking, because the Portuguese were really the first to get there, etc. But once the English got going, they took it to an entirely new and different level. From the beginning of the 18th century, slaves constituted the main commodity of the African trade, and the English dominated that trade. Between 1701 and 1810, England exported from West Africa over 2 million slaves, about 2/3 of the total number shipped by the three major superpowers in the slave trade. The other two were France and, of course, Portugal, that transported about 600,000 slaves each during the same period. So these are millions of slaves, millions of people we are talking about, and these are the three leading countries. They are also, of course, three of the most advanced countries today.
So why wasn't the labor taken from America or...
Very good question, and I'll come to that just a bit. This led to what we refer to, or should refer to, as slave cities. That means that the cities that grew up in the port towns of Europe and also the port towns of America, of the American continent, were basically slave ports. They were taking large number of slaves from one part of the world to another. And they were being remitted the profits from this incredibly lucrative trade. So Liverpool became the leading slave port in all of Europe. Why was it Liverpool that became the leading slave port? It was because Lancashire, the county of Lancashire, is where the Industrial Revolution first took off. What is that? That is that when these new machines were developed that could make raw cotton into cloth much faster than the older process, which was all done by hand, then those machines began to pull in as much cotton as possible. That became the heart of the textile revolution, which is the heart of the industrial revolution as a whole.
Sir, I have two questions.
Sure.
One is that since in the previous class we studied that capitalism can largely be defined by wage labor.
Correct.
But however, in this transatlantic slave trade, we see that there is no concept of wage labor here.
Yes.
So wage labor was something reserved only for the Europeans, and does that add an element of racism
What
into
an
it?
excellent question. Really a superb question. So in the Lancashire mills, etc., where the Industrial Revolution was taking off, that's where wage labor was being employed. For the production of the raw materials to feed those mills, where wage labor and capitalism had come into being, capitalism resorted to slavery in order to feed the mills that were that required those raw materials. So right in the beginning of capitalism, you had both forms of labor. Capitalism proper is wage labor, but to feed the mills, you could get those raw materials from all the other kinds of labor that were happening. So you could get it from India, you could get it from China. However that was being done, the traders could procure it from there, right? So whether that was being done via the caste system or whether that was being done via any other system didn't matter. But on the American continent, they created these slave plantations. Why did they create the slave plantations on the American continent per se? Although we'll study that in greater detail, but the mukhtasar answer, the brief answer is that they needed, well, firstly, the climate there was perfect for cotton plantation and this kind of agriculture. And they could then organize that with slave labor any which way they wanted to. As opposed to going to India, where if they tried to reorganize the labor in the way that they wanted to, what would happen in India? 1857 revolt would happen. Various revolutions would start. Now you had these people who had been picked up, uprooted from their domestic country, taken to some other place in these boats, packed like sardines, and there you could organize that production in any which way you wanted to. Why slavery in particular? Why not wage labor? One of the answers has to do with the fact that on the American continent, land was plentiful. There was no shortage of land. So anybody that was brought in as a wage laborer, let's say, could simply run away to the West and start a farm over there. Start an independent farm somewhere aage jaake, right? So that's why they had to be enslaved in order that they would not move out of the plantation. And that's what the slaves were always attempt to do, is get out of the plantations, move somewhere further into the hinterland and try and set up their own farms. Question?
No, I had a question regarding what you just mentioned. Wage labor we can have then if people, you are treating them as equal. But here we're talking about subhuman types when the Atlantic slave trade happened. Because I remember I took a course on African literature and
yes.
people had this thing around their throat which they were walking and there was no way they could be treated as an equal. They weren't given a permission to take a bath or anything. So how can we say that they could have proper jobs? Like wage labor would be a job sort of thing, right?
Who could have proper jobs?
The slaves, the Africans.
I'm not saying they had proper jobs, I'm saying they were slaves. The people who had jobs.
The question comes that they could have wage labor then.
I'm saying they couldn't. I'm saying that if the Europeans had brought over purely wage labor, the wage laborers would have run away and would run away and create their own farms. And to stop that from occurring, they had to basically indenture them. They had to make sure that they would not run away. And that's why they enslaved them.
The last question, second question I had was, when we see the Industrial Revolution progressing, there was this line in the other reading which I found interesting, was that slavery was too rigid for the industrial revolution, hence, there was the...
Yes, we'll come to that in a bit. Yes, when the Industrial Revolution begins in America, that's when the conflict between the North and the South begins. But we'll come to that in just a bit, okay? Some of your questions, many of your questions actually might even be answered in the course of the presentation, so bear with me. All right, so what's happening now is Liverpool becomes the leading slave port in Europe. The main French slaving port was Nantes. In 1700, the Royal African Company expected to sell slaves at 4 times the value of trade goods paid for them, while private traders expected to return a return of 6 to 1. So if I invest $100 and buy slaves with that, I can expect a return of $400 to $600. So slave trading was incredibly lucrative. It was also sometimes a bit risky because you were on the sea, you had to move from Europe to Africa, capture slaves, move from there to sell them to the plantation owners in Southern America, etc., on the American continent. So it could also be risky and you could also lose, which every business has an element of risk in it. But this is a horrific kind of business. It's a gruesome business. Yes.
Small technicality. This was all like businessmen, individuals.
It was both. In the beginning, as we saw in the previous lecture, it was mainly businessmen, what you would call businessmen, merchants, etc. And although they're slavers, so I don't want to dignify them by calling them businessmen, right? But they are not necessarily with the state itself. But once the whole thing began, and it became very obvious and clear that this was a very lucrative business, then the governments themselves were involved. And the governments themselves were involved in facilitating this entire trade, in regulating it, and ensuring that it, was successful in all sorts of ways. The states themselves were involved. Okay, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams argues that the slave trade and its adjuncts, in fact, provided the capital that allowed England to take off into the Industrial Revolution. What an incredibly important point and argument. So this is the process through which the necessary wealth was accumulated that allowed for the Industrial Revolution to take off. And in fact, I would add to this that the second major process that was going on was the conquest of Bengal. That also yielded incredible amounts of new wealth, which the English could then use to invest into the so-called Industrial Revolution. I mean, it is an Industrial Revolution, but we should not forget that both slavery and colonialism, and of course the third major thing was the opium trade with China, which begins in the which leads England and China to go to war twice, 2 opium wars in the 1840s, etc. These were the 3 major lucrative regions through which the capital was first accumulated that could allow for the Industrial Revolution to take off.
It's my first class, शायद आपने mention किया पहले, but जब slaves को initially जब extract कर रहे थे from क्या कहते हैं African regions और regions से, तो कोई उस process में भी retaliation नहीं हुई?
All right, so we'll work that out. All of these things are mentioned. Let's have a look at what happened. So what were the destinations? I did talk about this in the previous class. The major destination was, of course, Brazil. Brazil is where the vast majority of the slaves went. During the 17th century, Brazil received 42% of the slaves shipped, and Spanish America received 22%, but the British Caribbean now took 20% of the supply, and the French Caribbean another 12%. So that's where they ended up. During the 18th century, Senegambia and Sierra Leone receded further into the background, while West Africa became the major source of supply. As I told you in my previous lecture, I've been to West Africa, and I have been to the slaving port, the Gori Island, from which millions of people were deported and sent. Why Africa? In the first millennium of AD, Europe did indeed furnish slaves to the Muslims and the Byzantines. Okay? So slavery is not sort of new in that sense. The Atlantic slave trade is different from previous slave trades. But previously also there's been slavery. The whole of the Greek and the Roman empires were built on the foundation of slavery. The famous Spartans that we love to watch in movies and that we so admire for their militancy and so on, that was an entire civilization based mainly on the slavery of the Helots. So slavery has existed for a long time. But what the Atlantic slave trade does is that it brought in an accelerated process on such an industrial scale that you'll see it had devastating consequences for Africa. But first, let's look at some of the broad history of slavery. Europe used to give slaves to Muslims and the Byzantines. You might be shocked to hear that. Ye kaise ho sakta, sir? Why did they give slaves to the Muslims? But that is true that is part of history. The centuries of the Crusades, Muslims enslaved Christians and the Christians enslaved Muslims. And a pattern that continued in the Iberian Peninsula until the end of the 15th century. In the 13th century, the Genoese and the Venetians began to import Turkish and Mongol slaves through Tana on the Black Sea, while most of the slaves imported into Europe during the 14th century were Slavs and Greeks. And some people say the word Slav or Slavic comes from slave or is a derived term for slave. Coal miners and salt pan workers in Scotland were still enslaved in the 17th and the 18th centuries. Some even were made to wear collars marked with their owners' names. In addition, Scottish and Irish prisoners of war were sent into temporary servitude, temporary slavery, etc. So slavery does have a long history. There's no doubt about that. And also you have a history of indentured servitude, which is kind of temporary slavery. Okay. Like we often say indentured bonded labor in Pakistan. We use this term for jo bhatta mazdoor वगैरह काम करते हैं. The English relied heavily on indentured servitude to provide labor for the New World colonies. The cost of an indentured servant was less than that of a slave, At the same time, indenture was limited in time, hedged about with customary and legal restrictions, and subject to the relative ease with which servants could escape. Okay? So indentured labor means you owe somebody a debt, and you settle with them that I will work for you for 5 years in order to pay off the debt. That's what bonded indentured labor means. It's like debt bondage. Okay? So Europeans were in debt bondage sometimes to their lords, etc., and they would have to work this off. So that kind of slavery also existed. Now, one of the main questions that Amna asked and others also asked is, why not the Indians? Why weren't the, what we call the Red Indians, the Native Americans, why weren't they, brought to, why weren't they used for slave plantations? During the first phase of their colonization, the Spaniards had no compunction about enslaving Indians. And if you've done the reading, I won't go into the details, but in the first phase, they did get the Indians to do the cotton plantations and so on. But what happened? Indian proximity to their native groups encouraged rebelliousness and frequently escape. See, they were not so cut off from their tribe as such. They were in their own homeland. They had lived there for 20,000 odd years, 20,000 odd years. So they knew the land, they knew the terrain, they were the people of the earth. They knew it better, in fact, than the Europeans knew it. And they had kith and kin over there, they had family over there, they had tribal connections over there. The English colonists also feared that Indian slavery would alienate Native American allies in the war against the Spaniards and the French. Whoa, that's really interesting. They were using the Indians to fight other Europeans. And they were like, yeah, if we make them into our slaves, then they won't do the fighting for us against our European enemies, competitors, and that's what we want to principally use them for. Finally, Native American groups could be enlisted to aid in returning runaway African slaves to their masters. So this is another thing to which the Europeans put the Native Americans, how they use the Native Americans, help us catch our runaway slaves. I saw this movie and I felt sick to my stomach. I think it's called something Wakanda. What is it? Wakanda Forever. And in Wakanda Forever, you have the African Africans so fighting. Who are they fighting? The Mayans or something. And I just felt like this is such a colonial theme, because this is what you actually did in history. You did all of this in history. You made people fight each other.
They were fighting the Yucatan Mayans essentially.
Yeah.
Which was really disappointing.
Disappointing.
Saw two native powers fighting
That's
each
like
other.
euphemism of the century. I wanted to get up and throw my, Coca-Cola at the screen. I was like, this is what you're teaching people? That, people should be, the people that you colonize should be fighting each other, and you're sitting pretty, but that's what that movie is about. Made me sick to my stomach. Anyway, so that's not just a movie. That's what happened in history. Imagine that. Sale or capture at the African terminus of the trade divorced them from kinsmen and neighbors. This is very important. If you get picked up and you get transported to a country where you have no kith and you have no kin, you have no family, you have no relations, you have no relatives, you are isolated completely. Upon arrival in American ports, slaves of different ethnic and linguistic origin were then deliberately mixed to inhibit solidarity. And the Africans didn't all speak the same language. We all think, oh, they're Africans, so they must know each other. No, Africa is a huge continent with people of so many different ethnicities and languages and so on. They didn't know each other. They couldn't have known each other. So they were deliberately mixed them up so that there would be no solidarity between them. If they ran away, their skin color served as a mark of identification for every patroller bent upon reaping a reward. So if you saw a black person and they were sort of roaming around free somewhere, and you were a patroller, you were a European patroller, or you were an Indian hired by a European to patrol the lands, this had to be a runaway slave because he's black. And all the blacks were at that time pretty much slaves. So you knew, capture him, get him back, you get money for it. Yes.
So what about the variation in skin tone in perhaps the Indian subcontinent? How did they
Indian subcontinent?
Indian subcontinent with a relatively...
They're so far away. We're talking about the Atlantic slave trade. There are very few Indians. Are you talking about Native Americans?
No, I'm thinking Indians hired by the British to fight...
Oh, Native Americans. No, they're very different.
Native...
They're very different from, obviously from, I mean, I think that's pretty obvious that they're ethnically very different stock of people.
I thought you were talking about Indian subcontinent के लोग.
No, वो तो कहीं है ही नहीं इधर. They're not even here in any significant number at all. So yeah, they're a different ethnic stock, because if you know anything about the Native American migration into America, that is said to have occurred in a period of the Ice Age, about 20,000 years ago, when from the Mongolian plateau, the grasslands, they crossed over from Asia, and then basically over Alaska they crossed over and populated the American continent. So they are a completely different ethnic stock, genetically related, more closely related to Mongolian and Asian people than they are to African people. Okay, so very different. Question?
There have been numerous some known instances of African slaves running away and marrying into Native American
Yes,
tribes as well.
yes, quite right. And also as the oppression and genocide of the Native Americans became worse and worse, and as the resistance of the Native Americans to the Europeans coming into their land and taking over their traditional territory, as that began to happen, they became more and more rebellious, and as they became more and more rebellious, then that solidarity started to come about, which that horrific movie seems to try to contradict. Okay, so you get the picture. Now what's going on in Africa? So an excellent question was asked, was there resistance in Africa? What was going on in Africa? Well, what was going on in Africa is that the Europeans financed and organized the slave trade in Africa. The capture, delivery, and control and maintenance of captives while waiting for ocean transport remained mostly in African hands. So the Europeans would get the Africans to catch the other Africans, bring them to the ports, load them to the ships, and then the Europeans would take over, and so on. European expansion dovetails with pre-existing African circuit of exchange, not altering their basic structure, but merely adding to the flow of goods through them. Only in the rarest of instances did the Europeans engage in hunting slaves themselves. They got the Africans to do the hunting for them. African collaboration in turn strengthened existing states and spurred state formation in areas where no states had existed before European impact. Now the African states began to transform essentially into slave-providing states. Not only are the Europeans picking up Africans and taking them, but the African continent itself the whole social structure of the African continent is being transformed. Not just that people are leaving, but that the whole political economy of Africa gets transformed by the slave trade. Who's in power? Which tribe gets to be on top? What is the structure of power? How do they stay in power? All of these things. What is the economy itself? What are they producing now? What's the principal thing through which they're making their wealth? Where does power reside? All of that gets transformed completely. So what were the mechanisms of enslavement? Purani zamane mein, for instance, pawnship was one. When a crime was punished by severing a person from his lineage, not only was such an individual cut off from the support of his kin, but he was declared to be at odds with the supernatural order. So this was something that existed in Africa already. Judicial separation of a person from the protection of his lineage, and warfare for captives. These were the three major sources of slavery. So potential slaves in general, whether pawns, criminals, or captives, were all obtained by cutting their ties from kin and transferring the victim to the owner's kinship group. Chattel slavery, which is different from the pre-capitalist African slavery. What's the difference between chattel slavery and the older form of slavery? Chattel slavery is when you actually pay for somebody like you're buying a cattle. Okay, that's chattel slavery. There are other forms of bondage, etc., like the Mamluk warriors that you may know about. They were also slave soldiers. But the Mamluks also had their whole dynasty, they had their whole kingdom. They had an empire. And that's not just true for the Mamluks. It's also true for the Tughlaqs and the Lodhis and so many other slave dynasties that we saw in North India and we saw in the Arab world as well, etc. So that kind of slavery is quite different from this new kind of slavery, because this is now slavery almost on an industrial scale, and it's slavery in which you buy the other person completely, and from that point they're like a means of production, a tool that you can purchase. So much more brutalizing than pre-capitalist slavery. Firearms now began to change the whole balance of power and arguably the entire political economy of Africa. With the Atlantic slave trade, demand for slaves in West Africa increased, and a number of states became centered on the slave trade, and domestic slavery increased dramatically. Defeated people in war were sold off as quickly as possible, a practice that was called eating the country. From the 15th to the 19th centuries in Ghana, major sources of slaves came from warfare, slave markets, pawning, raids, kidnapping, and tributes, while minor sources were from gifts, convicts, communal or private deals. The large-scale possession of firearms by the people in the forest greatly altered the balance of political power and speeded up the formation of new polities. So when the Europeans wanted to get people to go and pick up slaves, etc., they were, let's say there are two tribes. One tribe is saying, we're going to fight the Europeans are not good people. The other tribe is saying, our enemy is the African tribe, not you people. What happens is that the Europeans give those people guns. When they have guns, they're able to conquer their enemy. When they're able to conquer their enemy, they enslave them and give them to the Europeans. So in this way, through so many different vicious wars, the Europeans used the rivalry amongst the Africans to basically feed the slave trade.
So it comes down to divide and conquer?
Absolutely correct. Absolutely, yes. When that is stated, that's really like 200-300 years of history that we have behind it.
But was it so the Europeans very actively pursued this strategy, having known that
Yes.
there create rivalries?
Yes.
Because African states were very small and very prone to fighting.
Some of them were small, some of them were also big states. Like Benin state was a huge state.
So they just promoted the rivalries in that sense.
That's absolutely
Actively,
correct.
okay.
Yes, they actively promoted the rivalries. They were looking out for me, myself, and I. And slavery was their major profit-making enterprise in Africa. And so they were giving arms to anybody who would give them slaves. And that changed the whole balance of power in Africa, yes.
And also, it's also mentioned in the reading that the things, the guns and every other thing that was given to these African rulers for the slaves in return, they were also things that were not needed in Europe anyways.
Yeah, a lot of
They
them.
were,
In Walter Rodney, we come to that argument, yes.
जो इंडेंचर्ड लेबर थी वो यूरोपियंस
वो
खुद करते
वो यूरोपियंस थे जी Okay, so you get the picture. आगे चलते हैं. So look at the impact of this slavery on the African continent. The impact is horrific. Kano, half the people are enslaved. Senegambia, from the 1300s to the 1900s, nearly a third of the people enslaved. Ghana, Mali, Segao, and Songhai, a third of the people enslaved. Sierra Leone, about half the people enslaved. Vai people in the 19th century, 3/4 of the people enslaved. Dola of Cameroon, Lower Niger and the Congo, Kasanji Kingdom, Choke, Angola, etc., nearly half the people enslaved. Ashanti, Yoruba, a third of the people enslaved. Kanem, a third of the people enslaved. Borno, 40% enslaved. Fulani Jihad, about a third to 2/3 enslaved. Sokoto, half people enslaved. Adrar, 15%. Gurma, 75%. I mean, the whole population is almost, you can imagine, completely decimated by this horrific, gruesome slave trade. This, then, is the legacy of European capitalism, really, in Africa. This is the origin of the capitalist mode of production in Africa.